Greetings everyone. My name is Nandini Tewari and today I will be reviewing the 14th problem of IYPT 2024, the ruler trick. This is my presentation for round 4 of INYPT 2024. So let us look at firstly the structure of the review. We'll firstly talk about the task at hand and we'll understand the problem statement. Secondly, we'll move to the review of the reporter and the review of the report. Thirdly, we'll move to the review of the opponent and the review of the opposing points. And lastly, we'll talk about the task conclusion, which will include the final verdict on the fulfillment of the task by both the reporter and the opponent. Starting off firstly with the task. The task is, and I quote, place a ruler on the edge of a table and throw a ball at its free end. The ruler will fall. However, if you cover a part of the ruler with a piece of paper and repeat the throw, then the ruler will remain on the table while the ball will bounce off it. Explain this phenomenon and investigate the relevant parameters. So firstly, I will underline the main pointers according to me to investigate and know more about the experiment. So if we come to the setup of the experiment, a ruler on the edge of a table needs to be set up, and then in the primary stage of the experiment, a ball needs to be thrown at the free end of the ruler without any other object covering the ruler. The ruler in this case will just fall. However, in the second part of the experiment, which is where we will be investigating more, we will be covering a part of the ruler which is on the table with a piece of paper, and we will be repeating the throw. And in this case, the ruler should remain on the table while the ball will just bounce off it. So in this case, the entire idea is to explain this phenomenon and why the ball will be bouncing off the ruler in the second case, but it will be getting the ruler to fall as well in the first one. And we need to investigate the relevant parameters which affect the two different readings. So now, after we understand this, we can also just look into the more physical and scientific explanation of this review. So the phenomenon described involves placing a ruler partially covered with a piece of paper on the edge of a table and throwing a ball at its free end, which we've already discussed. Now, this phenomenon can be explained by the concept of rotational inertia, also known as moment of inertia. When the ruler is uncovered, its entire length experiences the force of the ball, causing it to rotate and fall off the table. Now, in the second part, when the ruler is covered with a piece of paper, we understand that when the portion of the ruler is covered, it effectively reduces the length of the ruler that can rotate freely. This in turn decreases the rotational inertia of the ruler ball system, making it more difficult for the ruler to rotate and fall off the table. To investigate the relevant parameters, one could vary the length of the ruler covered with the paper, the material and thickness of the paper, the mass and the velocity of the ball, the angle at which the ball is thrown, and so on. By systematically altering these parameters and observing the resulting outcomes, one can gain insights into how each factor affects the stability of the ruler ball system and the likelihood of the ruler remaining on the table. So now, after we've discussed this, let's move to the review of the reporter. The reporter in our case is Sarthak. Now let us firstly look at the strong points. The strong points of Sarthak's report are as follows. Firstly, he very deeply analyzed the different concepts of physics involved. Secondly, his experimental analysis is broken down into several segments for a better understanding of the model, which was much appreciated. Thirdly, the attention to detail in terms of the movement of the ruler, the sheet of the paper, the different angles at which the ball should strike the ruler, etc. were also well analyzed. Fourthly, the arithmetic explanation and backing are also included in almost all the experimental models. And lastly, the basic experimental proof and demonstration are provided for all the distinct methods of evaluation. The points of improvement are as follows. First of all, there is an error in definition. On the fifth slide, it is defined that a ruler is a rigid cylinder. I will be showing a screenshot of the PPT in just a while with the exact definition underlined, but this is clearly a very silly mistake on his part since a ruler is not a rigid cylinder and therefore this error needs to be corrected. Secondly, the case when the ruler will not fall without a sheet of paper covering one end of it is not shown. The same is being talked about at 0.26 seconds in the video, but a recording of the experiment or even a few pictures explaining the process are never included in the PPT, which is a gap in experiment and should have been mentioned. Thirdly, the different types of paper while were mentioned, but the physical factors like mass, density, shape, smoothness, etc., which differentiate them from one another, and most importantly, the experiments to investigate the effects of the different attributes on the readings were ignored, which is a huge gap in the experimental model, since this is a very important element and a very important factor which had to be analyzed in this problem statement. So while different types of paper were discussed in the video and in the PPT, experiments of the same and how readings differed from one paper type to another and how different attributes affected the readings in different ways were never mentioned, never analyzed, and never investigated. Fourthly, physical characteristics of the ball like the size, density, mass, material, etc., while were very vaguely discussed, were also mostly ignored, and again, experiments about the same were also never conducted, which is again a huge gap in the experiment, since this was again a very important aspect which had to be analyzed in this problem statement. This is just a screenshot of the slide where the ruler is defined as a rigid cylinder, and this should be corrected. Moving on with the points of improvement, the fifth point is that while the arithmetic equations and conclusions were mentioned, they were not explained properly and they were just skimmed through. Sixth of all, and the points 6, 7, 8 are correlated, so I will not be taking them separately. But a huge error and a huge issue with Sarthak's PPT and Sarthak's video was that the idea and the concept of a PPT and a video explanation were essentially swapped. There was a lot of content, most of it which was unnecessary on the slides in the PPT, while the verbal explanation was negligible. It should have been the other way around, with the PPTs not being very content heavy and the video explanation being very thorough of the idea, the topic, and the solution. The video was also sped up to around 2x of its original pace to fit the 12-minute time limit, which made it very hard for me as the reviewer, and even I believe for the opponent, to analyze the report and to understand the problem statement at hand. Also, the presentation was very cluttered with a ton of questions and phrases typed out, and it should have been ideally been spoken out, but instead it was all typed out, which made it very hard to navigate through the presentation and to understand which points were actually necessary and actually important to the problem statement, and points which were just unnecessarily put up there. Also, economics references and quotes from different scientists were also put into the presentation, which again attributed and contributed to the video being much longer than actually 12 minutes, and also just unnecessarily wasted a lot of time. And all of that just was not needed. Instead, the time spent on all of this unnecessary details could have been spent on actually analyzing points which were missed out on, such as the attributes of the ball affecting the readings of the experiment, or the different types of paper and the material affecting the readings of the experiment, which were actually important and crucial, in fact, to the experiment. So the final verdict that I would give on the reporter in the report would be that a much better utilization of the time is required, since the video was, again, like I said, sped up to fit the time limit. And it still missed out on many important topics and explanations and included unnecessary analogies. So even after the video had to be sped up because of how long it was, it still did not cover all the important points, which tells us that there is clearly a need to better prioritize the time given to all the experimentalists, and to better utilize and prioritize the main topics which actually contribute to the experimental value of the topic, and not just touch and go on all unnecessary topics and details. Now we come to the review of the opponent. The opponent here is Parth Main. Coming to the strong points, Parth very correctly summarized the explanation of the report at the very beginning of the PPT, which was good to see. Secondly, he also very aptly divided the opposition points categorically. So some of them were phenomenon explanation, theory, experiments, and so on. He also understood the shortcomings in the presentation style and spoke about how the presentation was sped up. It was also cluttered, which were problems that even I faced as the reviewer while reviewing the report. The points of improvement are as follows. There was an error in the second slide, which was the summary of the report. In the last line, it was written, and I quote, "Effects of other parameters such as the mass of the ball and the type of the paper were discussed." In actuality, they were not actually discussed or evaluated, they were just merely mentioned, which proves a huge gap in the experiment. The reason why I'm bringing up this point is because, like I've already talked about it earlier in the presentation as well, while the reporter did mention the different masses of the ball and did talk about the different types of paper with different densities, different shapes, etc., he never experimented with the different masses of the ball or the different types of paper, and never actually took out the readings and the difference in readings to understand the experiment and the topic better, which proves a huge gap in the experiment, since the different attributes of the ball and the different attributes of the paper would have made a huge difference to the topic and its experiments, and would have been a crucial part of this topic. But it was very easily ignored. Coming to the second point, the opposition very nicely noticed the gap in the qualitative research, but at the same time did not realize the missing explanation of the types of paper based on its physical attributes and the effects of the balls with different characteristics on the readings of the experiment. This is a screenshot of the second slide where in the last line it is mentioned, and as I quoted earlier as well, that the effects of the other parameters such as the mass of the ball and the types of paper were discussed, while in actuality they were never actually discussed or experimented. They were just merely mentioned and the reporter just moved on with the report. Now we come to task conclusion. The task was, and as we've already discussed earlier as well, that a ruler had to be placed on the edge of a table, and when a ball would be thrown at it, it would just very easily fall. However, if a part of the ruler would be covered with a piece of paper and then the throw would be repeated, the ruler will remain on the table while the ball would just bounce off it. The main task of the reporter was to explain this phenomenon and to investigate the relevant parameters, and the main task of the opposition was to understand and to evaluate if the reporter was successfully able to explain this phenomenon, and also to understand if the investigation was done on all the relevant parameters or if there were any shortcomings in the reporter's report. Now, according to me, the task was mostly fulfilled. If we look at the reporter did miss some important qualitative research points, but regardless, did cover quite a few topics and did investigate on quite a few fronts. At the same time, one huge issue in the reporter's report, PPT and video was that better time management and presentation skills are very crucially required, since the time management and the presentation skills did affect the presentation and the showcasing of the report in a huge manner. Coming to the opponent, improvement is very obviously required in the ability to catch nuanced and small mistakes in the report of the reporter, but at the same time, the opponent was able to understand the topic very well and did summarize it quite beautifully at the start of the PPT itself. So with that, I finish my review. Thank you so much for joining me in this journey and for giving me this opportunity. I hope I was able to do justice to both the reporter and the opposition.